At 20 minutes to 6 in the evening, after almost 9 hours parked in a lobby chair inside a building he himself owned, Daniel Hargrove still had no name as far as the staff were concerned. They had moved him out of his seat, made jokes about him in front of the whole floor, and called security to walk him out because he was bad for the branch's image. Nobody had thought to ask who he was. Then the company's chief financial officer came running across the lobby floor, dropped a payroll folder in front of him, and asked for a signature. The room went dead quiet. The man everyone had spent the day humiliating was the same man whose signature put money in every one of their bank accounts. Iron Haven Logistics ran freight through 11 states, and every single share of the company belonged to one person. Daniel Hargrove had built it from a rented warehouse and 2 second-hand trucks, and across the 20 years since, he had never once put his own photo up in a lobby. His business cards carried no title. He answered his own inbox. Most of the 4,000 people who drew a paycheck from him wouldn't have known his face if he'd stepped into an elevator with them, and he had always seen that as a strength rather than a gap. His reasoning for it was something he no longer bothered explaining out loud. A company shows its real character in how it treats people who can't do anything for it. Owners get politeness handed to them automatically, and automatic politeness told him exactly nothing about a place. So he kept his face off the walls, his name off the trucks, and he read the branch reports the way other men checked the weather. The figures coming out of the Ridgeview branch had looked strong for 3 quarters running. Everything beneath those figures was quietly falling apart. Partner renewals were slipping with no explanation attached to them. 2 regional carriers had let contracts expire rather than renew, and the exit interviews from departing front desk staff kept circling back to one idea, phrased differently each time, that the culture at that branch hinged entirely on how you looked when you walked through the door. Daniel had watched that pattern take root before, and he knew how it worked. It never arrived all at once. It crept in through small decisions, one after another, until nobody in the building remembered agreeing to any of it. Revenue papered over it for a while. Revenue always did for a while. So he scheduled a site visit to Ridgeview. He did it through the normal channel, the branch calendar, 9 days out, with a note that he wanted to review operations and meet the leadership team. He used his real name, no title, no company listed, no assistant, no advance notice. He'd done the same thing at 4 other branches over the past 3 years, and nothing had ever come of it. The branch director at Ridgeview was Warren Sloan, who had run the building for 6 years and had numbers on his side to prove he deserved it. Sloan didn't manage his own schedule. His assistant, Renee Coulter, did that, and she'd held the job long enough that the floor treated her calls as his. On the Tuesday before the visit, Renee opened the branch calendar and found a request from a name she didn't recognize, no company attached, no title given. She checked the client database. Nothing. She checked the vendor list. Also nothing. She already had 140 minutes of Sloan's Thursday locked in, including lunch with a freight brokerage that had been courting them since spring. She flagged the mystery request as pending, which in the branch's system meant it stayed technically alive while vanishing from every screen anyone actually looked at. Then she closed the file and never thought about it again. Thursday arrived gray and cold. Daniel drove himself, parked at the far end of the visitor lot, and walked through the main doors at 8:45 with 15 minutes in hand. He had on a button-down shirt worn soft at the collar and plain jeans. No briefcase, just a folder under one arm and a phone in his pocket. That was the entire inventory of the man who owned the building. The Ridgeview lobby had been redone 2 years ago, and it showed. Polished flooring, a glass wall overlooking the loading yard, 6 gray fabric chairs around a low table, and a reception counter with the Iron Haven name cut into brushed steel behind it. A turnstile separated the lobby from the elevators, and everything past it needed a badge. Diane Foster worked the front desk. 4 years into the job, she was skilled at moving people efficiently in whatever direction they were supposed to go. She glanced up when Daniel came in, took in the shirt, the jeans, the absence of any company badge, and recalibrated before he'd finished crossing the floor. "Good morning," Daniel said. "I have a 9 o'clock. Daniel Hargrove." She typed it in. Nothing came back. She tried it again, first and last, and got the same blank result. There was a second screen, the one showing pending requests, but almost nothing ever sat there, and she hadn't opened it in months. "I'm not finding you. Who were you meeting with?" "Mr. Sloane's office set it up. It should be on the branch calendar." She checked Sloane's public calendar, which showed a packed morning and a lunch appointment. She couldn't picture how a man dressed like this fit anywhere into it. "I'm not having anything here," she said. "Can I ask what it's regarding?" For the first time that day, Daniel had a real choice in front of him. He could hand her the one answer that would end the conversation instantly. He could say owner and watch the whole building rearrange itself around him inside 90 seconds. He'd learn nothing. He'd have driven 2 hours for a performance. "Operations review," he said instead. "It's a scheduled visit." She wrote his name on the visitor log because that was the procedure and slid the clipboard back across. The line now read, "Hargrove, Daniel, 9 a.m., Sloane." Anyone glancing at that page for the rest of the day would see in the man's own handwriting an appointment that existed. "I'll let the office know you're here," Diane said. "Have a seat and someone will come down." He took the chair nearest the window. The clock behind the desk read 8:59. Diane sent a message to Renee Coulter, a walk-in downstairs claiming a 9 o'clock with Sloane, no company listed, nothing in the system. Renee read it between 2 other tasks and typed back that there was no 9 o'clock and to have him wait. Neither of them gave it more than a few seconds. That exchange was the entire mechanism by which the owner of Ironhaven Logistics disappeared inside his own building, and it took under 2 minutes. At 9, the elevators started running. Daniel watched badges sweep through the turnstile in waves, watched people stop for packages and visitor stickers, watched 2 managers cross the lobby with coffee in hand and walk straight past an occupied chair without registering it. None of it stung him. He was counting. Frank Mercer came on shift at 9 and took the security post by the turnstile. A heavy-set man in his 60s who'd worked the building since before the renovation and long ago learned to tell the difference between someone lost and someone waiting. He looked at Daniel once, decided waiting, and left him be. It was the closest thing to respect anyone showed him in the first hour. At 9:20, a young woman came down carrying a stack of visitor badges. Daniel clocked her as someone still careful enough to notice things. Her name tag read Sophie Reyes with trainee printed underneath. Diane sent her to restock the water station at the end of the lobby. Once she'd filled the tray, Sophie, since he was the only person seated there, walked over and offered him a bottle. "Has someone helped you?" she asked. "They're checking, thank you." She went back to the desk, and he watched Diane say something brief that ended the exchange. He didn't need to hear it. He'd heard the same instruction in a dozen buildings over the years, and it always boiled down to the same idea. The front desk decides who counts as real. At 9:40, his phone rang. The screen read Victor Adams, and Daniel picked up because his CFO didn't call for the fun of it. "The payroll file needs your signature, and I can't send it electronically," Victor said. He'd been fighting this exact battle since March. After a vendor fraud incident that spring,
Someone with a delegated login had pushed nearly $200,000 through in fake invoices. The audit firm had rewritten the disbursement controls. Any transfer touching more than 100 accounts at once now required a wet signature from the sole owner, not a delegate, not a stamp. Ink from Daniel Hargrove. "Which cycle?" Daniel asked. "Both, regular payroll and the quarterly bonus. They're processing together this month. Just over 4,000 people." Victor was already staring at a calendar. "It has to reach the processor by 6 or nothing clears Friday." Daniel ended the call without saying where that would be. Partly because he didn't intend to be still in a lobby chair at 4, and partly because saying it aloud would have turned the day into a plan instead of an observation. He set the phone face down on his knee and kept watching. By 11, he had a fairly clear picture, and none of it was really about him. A freight consultant in an expensive suit walked in at 10:15 and had a badge in under 4 minutes. Nobody asked him for an appointment. 20 minutes later, a man in a work jacket with a small trucking company's name stitched over the pocket asked for procurement and was told to email instead. He stood there a moment with the address written on a sticky note, folded it into his pocket, and left. 90 seconds total. Nobody at the desk registered that anything had happened at all. That was the part that mattered. Daniel had come to Ridgeview expecting a scheduling glitch or a management issue, something with a name and an edge to it. What he was watching instead was a sorting machine. It ran on its own, without instruction, powered entirely by shoes and jackets and the confidence of whoever walked through the door, and everyone operating it believed they were simply being efficient. At 10:30, Denise Carver came down to collect a client. She ran client relations for the branch and moved at the pace of someone with a full calendar. She passed within 4 feet of Daniel's chair. Her eyes crossed him and kept moving, the way eyes slide across a potted plant. At 10:50, Corey Nash came out of the elevator with 2 colleagues from operations, laughing about something. He looked at Daniel, and unlike Denise, he actually saw him. Then he leaned toward the man beside him, said something behind a half-raised hand, and all 3 glanced over before heading out the front doors. 2 hours in the chair. 6 managers had crossed the lobby. 1 had genuinely noticed him. His name sat on the visitor's log in his own handwriting a few feet from the front desk, and not a single person had walked over to check it against anything. He thought about the drive home, 2 hours, and he already had enough to end 3 careers by the following Tuesday. He had the pattern. He had the small trucking outfit turned away at the door. He had a front desk running on appearance instead of records. That alone was more than most audits produced in a week. But a report built on 2 hours would be a report he could talk himself out of. Someone would say the desk was busy that morning. Someone would say the appointment slipped through a genuine system crack, which it had. Someone would say one bad Thursday wasn't a culture, and on paper that argument would hold, because Ridgeview's paperwork was excellent. There was a second option, and it was uglier. Stay in the chair, say nothing, let the building keep sorting him, and see how far the sorting went if left completely alone. Not 2 hours of it, but the whole day. Find out what happened to the person in that lobby once the building decided he didn't matter and had all day to act on it. He understood exactly what that meant. He would become the man who'd been sitting there since morning, which in a place like Ridgeview would stop being a fact about the schedule and start being a fact about him. The longer he waited, the more the waiting itself would look like proof of something. He wanted to watch the machine run all the way to the end. At 11, Diane Foster looked up and found him still there. Something crossed her face that wasn't quite discomfort. "Sir, I still don't have anything for you. You're welcome to leave a card and someone will follow up." "I'll wait. It might be a while." "That's fine." She went back to her screen. He settled into the gray fabric chair, the clock over his shoulder, the folder still unopened on his lap. For the first time all morning, he pulled out his phone and started writing things down. Not complaints, times, names off badges, the stitched jacket on the man turned away with a sticky note. He wasn't enduring anything. He'd simply stopped being a visitor at 11 o'clock and started being an auditor, and nobody in the building knew the difference had occurred. The clock behind Diane's head read 11:04, 6 hours and 36 minutes left in the day. The lobby emptied around noon and filled again by 1, and across that whole cycle nobody spoke to him. Daniel watched the rhythm of it from the gray chair by the window. Badge scans, lunch bags, 2 women from accounts sitting 11 minutes on the far side of the low table, deep in a vendor dispute, never once glancing his way. He'd become part of the furniture, almost technically so. The eye landed on him, registered no category, and moved on.
At 12:40, Diane went to lunch, leaving Sophie Reyes to cover the desk with instructions to call upstairs if anything complicated came up. Sophie glanced over at Daniel twice in the first few minutes. The third time, she came out from behind the counter with another water bottle and set it beside his folder. "You were here when I came in this morning," she said. "Since 8:45. That's not right." She glanced back at the desk as if the screen might have changed its answer. "Do you want me to try the branch director's office directly? I can call up." "You already tried, didn't you?" Diane said it was handled. Her mouth tightened around that word. "I'll call anyway." She dialed at 12:52. Daniel watched her sit through a long ring, then speak quietly for about 40 seconds. Whatever came back through the line ended the call fast. She didn't walk over to report it, and he didn't need her to. She stayed at the desk with her shoulders a little higher than before, and twice over the next hour she looked at him with something close to an apology. At 1:15 the talk started, because he was 8 feet from the counter, and nobody had bothered to lower a voice for a man who didn't count. Diane came back from lunch and asked what she'd missed. An operations coordinator leaning on the desk said the walk-in was still parked in the lobby. Diane said he'd been there all morning. The coordinator said he was probably a salesman waiting out the clock. The play, apparently, was to sit long enough that somebody eventually broke and took the meeting. Denise Carver came through at 1:30 on her way back from a client lunch, saw him in the same chair she'd passed at 10:30, and said something to the coordinator that ended with the phrase, "job beggar." She said it without any real malice, which was somehow worse, the tone of someone identifying a species. Then she badged through the turnstile and was gone. Daniel wrote 1:30 and her name into his phone and set it back on his knee. The list wasn't for revenge. He kept it because a report needed load-bearing detail, and because he'd learned long ago that people were remarkably good at forgetting what they'd said about someone they'd written off as nobody. The list was the difference between an accusation and a record. At 2, a client group arrived, 4 people from a regional distributor, and the lobby suddenly ran short of chairs. Denise came down to receive them, took in the seating, and for the first time in 5 hours walked directly toward Daniel. She looked at him the way you'd look at a coat left on a bench. "Sir, I'm going to need this area for our clients. There's seating by the elevators." "I'm here for a 9 o'clock with Mr. Sloan." "I'm sure someone will get to you if you could just move down." She'd already turned to wave the group over before he even stood. He took his folder and water and walked to the row of hard plastic chairs near the turnstile, not a waiting area at all, but the spot where couriers usually dropped off boxes.
Behind him, he heard Denise apologizing warmly to the distributor about noise from the yard, the whole register of professional courtesy she had never once spent on him. Frank Mercer glanced up from the security post as Daniel sat and gave him a small nod that was almost an apology of its own. The visitor log still sat on the counter across the lobby, his name at the top in his own hand, timed 9 o'clock, Sloane's name in the column beside it. 6.5 hours had passed. Diane had handled that page perhaps 30 times to log other visitors. Not one manager had walked over and turned it around. That was the number that stayed with him, not the insults, which were cheap and would evaporate. The number was 0. 0 verifications in 6.5 hours, inside a building that ran on chain of custody, bills of lading, and signature confirmation. A company whose entire product was the reliable movement of things people had promised to move. Not one person had performed the single act of checking a written record against a human being standing in front of them. From the hard chairs by the turnstile, he had a better view of the door. The day changed there. At 2:20, a man walked in wearing a canvas jacket stitched with Benning Freight Service over the pocket, carrying a folder that looked almost identical to Daniel's own. Harold Benning ran 11 trucks out of a yard 40 minutes east, and he'd been subcontracting overflow lanes for Ironhaven 9 years. He had a 2:30 with procurement to renew the contract. Diane found his name, it was in the system, and told him procurement was tied up in meetings, asked him to wait. Harold said that was fine, and sat down 2 chairs from Daniel, setting the folder on his knees the same way Daniel had his. They didn't speak for the first 20 minutes. Then Harold glanced over at the man who'd clearly been waiting longer than he had. "How long you been here?" "Since before 9. Harold exhaled through his nose. "Used to be they'd come down inside 5 minutes. 2-3 years back, I'd walk in and Tom from procurement would meet me at the door." He turned the folder over in his hands. "Now it's all email. I've sent this renewal 3 times, got 1 reply asking me to attach it in a different format." Daniel asked him what had changed, and Harold thought about it honestly, which was more than anyone wearing a badge had managed all day. Nothing changed with the work. Same lane, same on-time numbers, never lost a load for them. He shrugged. "What changed is they got a new crop of people up there who figure 11 trucks isn't worth an elevator ride. I know 4 outfits my size who stopped calling. Nobody quits loud. You just stop showing up." At 3:10, a coordinator came down, spoke to Harold for under a minute, and handed him an email address on a sticky note. Daniel watched the exact same 90-second transaction he'd seen at 10:35 that morning run this time on a different man by a different person. Harold folded the note into his pocket, said goodbye to Daniel, and walked out into the gray afternoon with his renewal still unsigned. Daniel sat very still for a while after that. He'd come to Ridgeview to figure out why a strong branch was quietly losing partners. He'd spent the morning treating his own mistreatment as the whole subject of the investigation. It wasn't the subject. It was a sample. Every hour he'd sat in that chair, the building had been doing the exact same thing to other people, people who didn't own the company and couldn't afford to sit there taking notes about it. They'd simply left. 9 years of Harold Benning had walked out the door in 90 seconds, and it hadn't registered anywhere as an event. The purpose of the day shifted shape in his hands. He wasn't collecting evidence that he'd been treated badly. That was trivial, and he'd never much cared. He was collecting the mechanism. Who decided?
Who watched and said nothing? Who had built a sorting system out of jackets and shoes and confidence and run it long enough that everyone inside experienced it as ordinary judgment instead of an unwritten policy? He was going to find all of them, not the ones who'd insulted him, but the ones who'd built it. At 4:40, it stopped being neglect and turned into sport. Corey Nash came down with 2 people from operations to see off a shipment, and Daniel was still in the plastic chair by the turnstile, folder on his lap, untouched water bottle beside him. Corey had seen him at 10:50 and recognized the shirt. "He's still here," Corey said, loud enough to carry. "Same guy, 6 hours." Someone made a comment about persistence. Then Corey raised his phone, framed Daniel in the plastic chair with the Ironhaven lettering glinting behind him, and took a photo. It landed in the branch operations group chat at 3:44 with a caption about the lobby's newest employee. Within 20 minutes, there were 19 replies. One person suggested giving him a badge. Another guessed he was chasing a job that had been eliminated in the spring. Denise Carver replied with a single line about having already relocated him once. 2 people asked which floor he was on so they could come look. They did come down. Between 4 and 4:34, separate employees rode the elevator to the lobby, crossed to a water station they didn't need, glanced at the man in the chair, and rode back up. Daniel counted every one of them. None asked his name. The building had turned a man waiting for an appointment, written in plain ink on its own log, into a small tourist attraction. At 4:50, Denise came down again, this time heading straight for the security post instead of the desk. Frank Mercer listened with his arms folded.
"He's been in that chair since this morning," Denise said. "We've got clients in and out. It looks bad, like we've got a man sleeping in the lobby." Frank said the man was waiting on an appointment. "There is no appointment," Denise said. "Renee checked this morning. He's a walk-in and he won't leave. I'd like him escorted out before the 5 o'clock client comes through." Frank looked past her at Daniel. He'd worked security a long time, had removed people from buildings before, had never once enjoyed it, and everything about this particular request sat wrong with him. He asked if anyone had actually spoken to the man about it. "I'm speaking to you about it," Denise said. "Please handle it before 5:30. She badged through and went up. Frank stood at his post a full minute, then walked over and stopped a respectful distance from the chair. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to head out shortly, coming from upstairs." Daniel said he understood, asked how long he had. "Give me till about 5:45, Frank said. "I'll stretch it as far as I can. For what it's worth, I don't think this is right." Then he asked the only question any employee at Ironhaven had asked him in 9 hours. "You said you had a meeting with who?" "Warren Sloan, 9 o'clock this morning." Frank wrote it on the back of his hand with a pen from his shirt pocket and said he'd check the log himself. He was 6 steps from the counter when the front doors opened. Victor Adams came through them at 5:38 in a suit that had spent the last 2 hours in a car, a leather portfolio under his arm. He'd never found a courier who could make the deadline. At 3:30 he'd given up, called Daniel's office for a location, been told the owner was at Ridgeview, and driven it himself. He'd spent the last hour of the drive on the phone with the payment processor, confirming the 6 o'clock cutoff. Payroll for just over 4,000 people, plus the quarterly bonus, had to clear before the window closed, or nothing would land on Friday. He came in fast and didn't stop at the desk. Diane Foster stood to intercept him, with the visitor procedure already forming in her mouth, and Victor went past her without breaking stride because he'd already spotted the soft-collared shirt in the plastic chair by the turnstile, exactly where the security post was. "Mr. Hargrove," his voice carried the length of the lobby.
He set the portfolio on the low table, opened it, turned it around. "Sir, I'm sorry, I need your signature immediately. We've got 20 minutes. The lobby didn't go silent all at once. It went silent in pieces. Diane froze with a visitor badge half extended. The 5 o'clock client group by the window stopped talking. Corey Nash, who'd come down at 5:35 to catch a ride home, stopped 4 feet from the elevator. Sophie Reyes put down the phone she'd just picked up. Frank Mercer turned around, pen still in hand. Daniel stood, and for the first time that day, people looked at his face instead of his shirt. He read the top sheet the way he read everything, completely, and it took 90 seconds while nobody in the lobby moved. Then he took the pen from the portfolio, signed the payroll authorization, turned the page, signed the bonus disbursement beneath it, closed the portfolio, and handed it back.
"Photograph it before you drive," Daniel said. "Send the images to the processor from the parking lot so the submission's in before the window closes." "Yes, sir." Victor was already moving, back out the doors at a jog. The name traveled around the room faster than any announcement could have carried it. Denise Carver had come down at 5:41 to confirm with security that the lobby had been cleared and arrived just in time to watch the man she'd moved to the courier chairs hand a signed payroll file to the company's chief financial officer. Corey Nash was still holding the phone with the photograph on it. Someone at the desk said the words out loud, quietly, the way people say something they've just understood. Daniel Hargrove, not a walk-in, not a salesman, the sole owner of Iron Haven Logistics, whose signature had just released every paycheck in the building, including the paychecks of the 19 people who'd replied to that photo. He didn't raise his voice. He picked up the folder he'd carried in at 8:45, the one nobody had ever asked him to open, and checked the clock behind the reception desk. 5:43. "I'd like a branch director in his conference room in 10 minutes, he said to the floor in general, "and nobody touches a calendar or a phone until I say so." Daniel made one call before he left the plastic chair. It went to the corporate systems desk, lasted 40 seconds, and accomplished 2 things. It locked administrative access to the Ridgeview branch calendar down to a single corporate account, and it suspended the credentials on the branch director's office, meaning that at 5:45 that evening, Renee Coulter lost the ability to open the very file she'd closed 9 days ago. Warren Sloan came down at 5:51 instead of waiting in his own conference room, which told Daniel plenty before either of them said a word. He arrived with his jacket half on, Renee 2 steps behind him, already apologizing loudly to a man he'd never laid eyes on. Daniel didn't shake his hand. "Upstairs," he said. They rode up in silence. The branch conference room had a glass wall facing the operations floor, and through it Daniel could see 24 people who hadn't gone home, standing at their desks, watching. He asked Sloan to close the blinds, asked him to sit, set his phone on the table, and left the folder he'd carried all day unopened. 4 things are being preserved as of 5:45, Daniel said. Corporate's already frozen the branch calendar. Nobody in this building can edit it, including either of you. The lobby log stays on that counter. Today's page doesn't leave it. The lobby camera footage from 8:30 this morning through 6 tonight is being pulled tonight. And the branch chat archive, every group, every channel, going back 12 months. Sloan started to say something about needing to understand the scope before committing to that, and Daniel cut him off without raising his voice. "You're misreading the arrangement. I'm not asking your permission. I'm telling you it's already done."
Renee Coulter had gone the color of paper. She understood first what the chat archive meant because she'd been in it, and because she was the person who'd moved a 9 o'clock appointment into pending status 9 days earlier, for reasons she hadn't thought about since.
Victor called at 6:04 to confirm the submission had gone through with 11 minutes to spare. Daniel told him to turn the car around and come back. Then he called the corporate human resources director, a man named Alan Pierce, and told him to be at Ridgeview by 8 the next morning with an outside investigator and a forensic reviewer for the chat data. Pierce asked what exactly he was investigating. Daniel said, "Everything except me." That distinction turned out to be the hardest one to hold on to, and he had to repeat it to Pierce twice more over the following 3 weeks. The instinct across the whole organization was to treat the day as an insult against the owner. Daniel kept steering it back toward the actual subject, that Ridgeview had built a system for deciding whose time was worth spending and had been running it on the public for years. The investigation opened Friday morning and ran for 19 days. The calendar data came first, since it was easiest to read. Daniel's appointment had gone on the branch calendar 9 days out, been moved to pending the Tuesday before, and never restored. What the audit found underneath was that pending status had been used 46 times over the previous 18 months. In 38 of those cases, the request had come from a company nobody at the branch recognized, or from an individual with no title attached. Almost none were ever restored. Pending wasn't a queue, it was a trash can with a polite name. The visitor log told the same story in handwriting. Daniel's name sat at the top of Thursday's page, timed 9 o'clock, Sloane's name beside it, and the log had been handled continuously all day by staff logging in other visitors. Nobody had turned the page around. Reviewers went back through 11 months of logs and found the same pattern in the ink itself. A whole population of names that appeared once were never badged through and never showed up again. The camera footage supplied the arithmetic that made everything else impossible to argue with. In 8 hours and 59 minutes, 41 badged employees passed within 6 feet of him, 9 looked directly at him, 4 came down from other floors during the 4 o'clock stretch for no discernible purpose, 0 checked his name against the log or the calendar. The chat archive was where it stopped being carelessness. Corey Nash's photograph sat there time-stamped 3:44, caption and all, with its 19 replies. But the forensic review pulled 12 months and found the photo wasn't an isolated incident. There was a running practice of it. A man in a stained work shirt from the previous November. A small carrier's representative described by the brand of his boots. A recurring joke going back the better part of a year about the type of person who came in through the front doors instead of arriving on someone's calendar, with managers participating in it. The part that finally quantified the damage came from client and vendor records. Pierce's team pulled every partner who'd gone dormant at Ridgeview through 3 years and started calling them. What came back wasn't a stack of complaints, it was a pattern of silence. 14 small carriers and suppliers had stopped renewing without a single formal grievance among them. Asked directly, most said the work had never been the problem. At some point, they'd understood they were being handled rather than served and had simply stopped calling. Ridgeview's numbers looked excellent because its large accounts were performing well. Underneath that, the branch had been quietly shedding the entire bottom of its partner base for years, and the loss had never once shown up in a report. Nobody quits loud. Daniel read the full findings on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after that Thursday. He sat with the closed report in front of him for the better part of an hour, thinking about a man with 9 years of clean loads walking into a gray afternoon with an email address in a sticky note in his pocket. Then he opened it back up and got to work, because he'd learned that decisions made in that particular hour were always slightly wrong, and 4,000 people were counting on him to get this one right. The consequences landed over the following 2 days. Warren Sloan was terminated, not over the appointment, which he'd never actually seen, and not over the insult, which he hadn't taken. The report established that the branch chat had been visible to him for 11 months, that the practice of photographing visitors had been reported to him directly by a departing front desk employee during an exit interview he'd personally conducted, and he'd done nothing except keep delivering strong quarterly numbers on top of it. Daniel told him as much in the same conference room, blinds open this time. Sloan argued for 20 minutes, the numbers, the volume the branch moved, a market where nobody could spare an hour on 11 trucks. Daniel let him finish all of it. You had 6 years and a full building. In 8 hours and 59 minutes, 41 of your people walked past a man with an appointment written on your own log, and not one of them checked it. That isn't the market. That's what you taught them was safe. Renee Coulter was let go that same afternoon. She'd moved the appointment, and the audit showed she'd used that same authority hundreds of times, deciding on her own judgment who was substantial enough to reach the branch director. She said correctly that nobody had ever told her not to. Daniel told her, also correctly, that nobody should have had to.
Corey Nash was terminated over the photograph and the chat history behind it. Denise Carver was suspended without pay and pulled from client relations for moving a waiting visitor out of a seating area to accommodate people she considered more valuable, and for instructing security to remove a man from the building without ever asking his name or checking a record. The 19 people who'd replied in the chat received discipline scaled to what they'd written, and every one of them sat through the review with Pierce's team. Then Daniel did the part that surprised corporate. Diane Foster wasn't fired. She'd been the first link in the chain, the one who never opened the pending window, never turned the visitor log around. By the letter of the findings, she had grounds to be gone. But when Pierce's investigator interviewed her, she didn't defend herself, didn't blame the system, didn't claim she'd been too busy. She said she'd looked at a man in a soft-collared shirt and made a decision about him in under 4 seconds, and that she'd been making that same decision for 4 years without ever once calling it what it was. Daniel read her interview twice. Then he moved her into the redesigned front desk operation and told her privately that the only reason he could do that was because she'd been willing to say the true sentence out loud when it cost her something. Everyone else in the building spent 3 weeks explaining. Sophie Reyes came out of it differently. The camera footage had caught all of it. The water at 9:20, the second bottle just before 1, the call she'd placed upstairs at 12:52 on her own initiative after being told the matter was handled. She was made permanent and put in charge of visitor verification training for the branch, which meant the newest person in the building ended up teaching procedure to people who'd been there a decade. Frank Mercer kept his post. The record showed he'd been instructed by a manager to remove a visitor, had stretched the timeline as far as he could, and had been the only badged employee in 9 hours to ask the man his name and write the answer down. Daniel told him the note on the back of his hand was the only piece of correct procedure performed at Ridgeview that day. The process rebuild took 6 weeks, and it was deliberately unglamorous. Pending status was eliminated from the calendar system entirely, replaced by a queue that required a written reason and a named person for any appointment left unconfirmed after 24 hours. Any visitor waiting longer than 20 minutes triggered an automatic alert to a manager who had to close it out by hand with a note. The visitor log went digital and cross-checked itself against the calendar in real time, so a name written at the desk would surface in the system whether or not anyone at the desk thought to look. The branch chat was archived, closed, and rebuilt under retention rules that made every message reviewable. Pierce's team called all 14 dormant partners, and 9 agreed to talk. But before any of those calls went out, Daniel made one himself, from his own office,
no assistant on the line. Harold Benning hadn't gone dormant 3 years ago. He'd walked out of the Ridgeview lobby on a sticky note in his pocket on a Thursday afternoon, and he was the reason the rest of the list got called at all. Daniel told him who he was. Then he told him he'd been sitting 2 chairs away at 2:20 that afternoon and watched Harold Freight Service get handed an email address after 9 years. Harold was quiet on the line for a while. The renewal was signed the following week at the terms Harold had originally asked for in a meeting held at his own yard instead of the Ridgeview lobby. The all-branch meeting happened on a Monday morning out on the concrete floor of the operations bay because Daniel didn't want a stage. He spoke for 11 minutes. He never described what it felt like to sit in that chair, and he never used the word humiliation. He put the photograph from the chat up on the screen behind him and left it there while he talked, and what he talked about were numbers. 41 employees, 9 hours, 0 verifications. 14 partners gone in 3 years with no complaint filed by any of them, because the people this branch had trained itself not to see were also the people least likely to complain. Every one of you can read a bill of lading. You verify a seal number on a trailer without being asked. You won't release a load to a driver whose paperwork doesn't match, and you're right not to. Then a person walks through the front door and you verify nothing. You decide who they are from a jacket. That's the whole failure. It isn't rudeness. It's a building that applies a standard to freight and refuses to apply the same standard to people. He told them the branch's revenue targets weren't changing and weren't being lowered as an apology. Then he told them that no revenue number that building produced would ever protect a manager who ran it the way it had been run, that he'd close a profitable branch before he'd defend one. Nothing about how he operated changed after that. He still kept his photo off the walls at every location, still left his title off his cards, and still never asked anyone at Ironhaven Logistics to be able to recognize the owner on site. What people at corporate suggested the whole thing could have been avoided with a portrait in every lobby, he pointed out that a portrait would only have taught the buildings to be careful about one particular face. What did change was small and permanent. At the very top of the visitor procedure, above the badge steps, above the log entry, above the verification protocol, on a laminated card at every Ironhaven reception desk across 11 states, there was now a single line printed before any instruction at all. Every person who comes through this door is welcomed with respect before we know who they are. Appearance is not a measure of a person's worth. A company only becomes genuinely strong when it treats everyone fairly, whether that person is the owner, a client, or an unfamiliar face waiting in the lobby, with no one thinking to ask his name.